To Build a Fire by Jack London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bob Neufeld. Day had broken cold and gray, exceedingly cold and gray, when the man turned aside from the main Yukon trail and climbed the high earth bank, where a dim and little-traveled trail led eastward through the fat spruce timberland. It was a steep bank, and he paused for breath at the top, excusing the act to himself by looking at his watch. It was 9 o'clock. There was no sun nor hint of sun, though there was not a cloud in the sky. It was a clear day, and yet there seemed an intangible pall over the face of things, a subtle gloom that made the day dark, and that was due to the absence of sun. This fact did not worry the man. He was used to the lack of sun. It had been days since he had seen the sun, and he knew that a few more days must pass before that cheerful orb, due south, would just peep above the skyline and dip immediately from view. The man flung a look back along the way he had come. The Yukon lay a mile wide and hidden under 3 feet of ice. On top of this ice were as many feet of snow. It was all pure white, rolling in gentle undulations where the ice jams of the freeze-up had formed. North and south, as far as the eye could see, it was unbroken white, save for a dark hairline that curved and twisted from around the spruce-covered island to the south, and that curved and twisted away into the north, where it disappeared behind another spruce-covered island. This dark hairline was the trail, the main trail, that led south 500 miles to the Chilkoot Pass, Dyea, and Saltwater, and that led north 70 miles to Dawson, and still on to the north 1,000 miles to Nulato, and finally to St. Michael on Bering Sea, 1,000 miles and 1,500 more. But all this, the mysterious far-reaching hairline trail, the absence of sun from the sky, the tremendous cold, and the strangeness and the weirdness of it all, made no impression on the man. It was not because he was long used to it. He was a newcomer in the land, a chechaquo, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things, and not in the significances. 50 degrees below zero meant 80-odd degrees of frost. Such fact impressed him as being cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to meditate upon his frailty as a creature of temperature, and upon man's frailty in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold, and from there on it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and man's place in the universe. 50 degrees below zero stood for a bite of frost that hurt and that must be guarded against by the use of mittens, ear-flaps, warm moccasins, and thick socks. 50 degrees below zero was to him just precisely 50 degrees below zero. That there should be anything more to it than that was a thought that never entered his head. As he turned to go on, he spat speculatively. There was a sharp, explosive crackle that startled him. He spat again, and again, in the air, before it could fall to the snow, the spittle crackled. He knew that at 50 below spittle crackled on the snow, but this spittle had crackled in the air. Undoubtedly it was colder than 50 below. How much colder he did not know. But the temperature did not matter. He was bound for the old claim on the left fork of Henderson Creek, where the boys were already. They had come over across the divide from the Indian Creek country, while he had come the roundabout way to take a look at the possibilities of getting out logs in the spring from the islands in the Yukon. He would be in camp by 6 o'clock. A bit after dark, it was true, but The boys would be there, a fire would be going, and a hot supper would be ready. As for lunch, he pressed his hand against the protruding bundle under his jacket. It was also under his shirt, wrapped up in a handkerchief, and lying against the naked skin. It was the only way to keep the biscuits from freezing. He smiled agreeably to himself as he thought of those biscuits, each cut open and sopped in bacon grease, and each enclosing a generous slice of fried bacon. He plunged in among the big spruce trees. The trail was faint. A foot of snow had fallen since the last sled had passed over, and he was glad he was without a sled, traveling light. In fact, he carried nothing but the lunch wrapped in the handkerchief. He was surprised, however, at the cold. It certainly was cold, he concluded, as he rubbed his numbed nose and cheek-bones with his mittened hand. He was a warm-whiskered man, but the hair on his face did not protect the high cheek-bones and the eager nose that thrust itself aggressively into the frosty air. At the man's heels trotted a dog, a big native husky, the proper wolf-dog, grey-coated and without any visible or temperamental difference from its brother, the wild wolf. The animal was depressed by the tremendous cold. It knew that it was no time for travelling. Its instinct told it a truer tale than was told to the man by the man's judgment. In reality, it was not merely colder than 50 below zero. It was colder than 60 below, than 70 below. It was 75 below zero. Since the freezing point is 32 above zero, it meant that 107 degrees of frost obtained. The dog did not know anything about thermometers. Possibly in its brain there was no sharp consciousness of a condition of very cold, such as was in the man's brain. But the brute had its instinct. It experienced a vague but menacing apprehension that subdued it and made it slink along at the man's heels, and that made it question eagerly every unwonted movement of the man, as if expecting him to go into camp or to seek shelter somewhere and build a fire. The dog had learned fire, and it wanted fire, or else to burrow under the snow and cuddle its warmth away from the air. The frozen moisture of its breathing had settled on its fur in a fine powder of frost, and especially were its jowls, muzzle, and eyelashes whitened by its crystalled breath. The man's red beard and mustache were likewise frosted, but more solidly, the deposit taking the form of ice and increasing with every warm, moist breath he exhaled. Also, the man was chewing tobacco, and the muzzle of ice held his lips so rigidly that he was unable to clear his chin when he expelled the juice. The result was that a crystal beard of the colour and solidity of amber was increasing its length on his chin. If he fell down, it would shatter itself like glass into brittle fragments. But he did not mind the appendage. It was the penalty all tobacco chewers paid in that country, and he had been out before in 2 cold snaps. They had not been so cold as this, he knew, but by the spirit thermometer at 60 Mile he knew they had been registered at 50 below and at 55. He held on through the level stretch of woods for several miles, crossed a wide flat of niggerheads, and dropped down a bank to the frozen bed of a small stream. This was Henderson Creek, and he knew he was 10 miles from the forks. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He was making 4 miles an hour, and he calculated that he would arrive at the forks at 12:30. He decided to celebrate that event by eating his lunch there. The dog dropped in again at his heels, with a tail drooping discouragement, as the man swung along the creek bed. The furrow of the old sled trail was plainly visible, but a dozen inches of snow covered the marks of the last runners. In a month no man had come up or down that silent creek. The man held steadily on. He was not much given to thinking, and just then particularly He had nothing to think about save that he would eat lunch at the Forks, and that at 6 o'clock he would be in camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to, and, had there been, speech would have been impossible because of the ice muzzle on his mouth. So he continued monotonously to chew tobacco and to increase the length of his amber beard. Once in a while the thought reiterated itself that it was very cold, and that he had never experienced such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his cheek-bones and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did this automatically, now and again changing hands. But rub as he would, the instant he stopped, his cheek-bones went numb, and the following instant the end of his nose went numb. He was sure to frost his cheeks. He knew that, and experienced a pang of regret that he had not devised a nose-strap of the sort Bud wore in cold snaps. Such a strap passed across the cheeks as well, and saved them. But it didn't matter much, after all. What were frosted cheeks? A bit painful, that was all. They were never serious. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was keenly observant, and he noticed the changes in the creek, the curves and bends and timber jams, and always he sharply noted where he placed his feet. Once, coming around a bend, he shied abruptly, like a startled horse, curved away from the place where he had been walking, and retreated several paces back along the trail. The creek, he knew, was frozen clear to the bottom. No creek could contain water in that Arctic winter. But he knew also that there were springs that bubbled out from the hillsides and ran along under the snow and on top the ice of the creek. He knew that the coldest snaps never froze those springs, and he knew likewise their danger. They were traps. They hid pools of water under the snow that might be 3 inches deep or 3 feet. Sometimes a skin of ice half an inch thick covered them, and in turn was covered by the snow. Sometimes there were alternate layers of water and ice-skin, so that when one broke through, he kept on breaking through for a while, sometimes wetting himself to the waist. That was why he had shied in such panic. He had felt the give under his feet, and heard the crackle of a snow-hidden ice-skin. And to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. At the very least it meant delay, for he would be forced to stop and build a fire, and under its protection to bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. He stood and studied the creek bed and its banks, and decided that the flow of water came from the right. He reflected a while, rubbing his nose and cheeks, then skirted to the left, stepping gingerly and testing the footing for each step. Once clear of the danger, he took a fresh chew of tobacco and swung along at his 4-mile gait. In the course of the next 2 hours he came upon several similar traps. Usually the snow above the hidden pools had a sunken, candied appearance that advertised the danger. Once again, however, he had a close call, and once, suspecting danger, he compelled the dog to go on in front. The dog did not want to go. It hung back until the man shoved it forward, and then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly it broke through, floundered to one side, and got away to firmer footing. It had wet its forefeet and legs, and almost immediately the water that clung to it turned to ice. It made quick efforts to lick the ice off its legs, then dropped down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that had formed between the toes. This was a matter of instinct. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the mysterious prompting that arose from the deep crypts of its being. But the man knew, having achieved a judgment on the subject, and he removed the mitten from his right hand and helped tear out the ice particles. He did not expose his fingers more than a minute, and was astonished at the swift numbness that smote them. It certainly was cold. He pulled on the mitten hastily, and beat the hand savagely across his chest. At 12 o'clock the day was at its brightest, yet the sun was too far south on its winter journey to clear the horizon. The bulge of the earth intervened between it and Henderson Creek, where the man walked under a clear sky at noon, and cast no shadow. At 12:30 to the minute he arrived at the forks of the creek. He was pleased at the speed he had made. If he kept it up, he would certainly be with the boys by 6. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and drew forth his lunch. The action consumed no more than a quarter of a minute, yet in that brief moment the numbness laid hold of the exposed fingers. He did not put the mitten on, but instead struck the fingers a dozen sharp smashes against his leg. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The sting that followed upon the striking of his fingers against his leg ceased so quickly that he was startled. He had had no chance to take a bite of biscuit. He struck the fingers repeatedly and returned them to the mitten, baring the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice muzzle prevented. He had forgotten to build a fire and thaw out. He chuckled at his foolishness, and as he chuckled he noted the numbness creeping into the exposed fingers. Also, he noted that the stinging which had first come to his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether the toes were warm or numbed. He moved them inside the moccasins, and decided that they were numbed. He pulled the mitten on hurriedly and stood up. He was a bit frightened. He stamped up and down until the stinging returned into the feet. It certainly was cold, was his thought. That man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in the country, and he had laughed at him at the time. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He strode up and down, stamping his feet and threshing his arms, until reassured by the returning warmth. Then he got out matches and proceeded to make a fire. From the undergrowth, where high water of the previous spring had lodged a supply of seasoned twigs, he got his firewood. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire, over which he thawed the ice from his face, and in the protection of which he ate his biscuits. For the moment the cold of space was outwitted. The dog took satisfaction in the fire, stretching out close enough for warmth and far enough away to escape being singed. When the man had finished, he filled his pipe and took his comfortable time over a smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled the ear-flaps of his cap firmly about his ears, and took the creek trail up the left fork. The dog was disappointed and yearned back toward the fire. This man did not know cold. Possibly all the generations of his ancestry had been ignorant of cold, of real cold, of cold 107 degrees below freezing point. But the dog knew. All its ancestry knew, and it had inherited the knowledge. And it knew that it was not good to walk abroad in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie snug in a hole in the snow and wait for a curtain of cloud to be drawn across the face of outer space whence this cold came. On the other hand, there was keen intimacy between the dog and the man. The one was the toil-slave of the other, and the only caresses it had ever received were the caresses of the whiplash and of harsh and menacing throat sounds that threatened the whiplash. So the dog made no effort to communicate its apprehension to the man. It was not concerned in the welfare of the man. It was for its own sake that it yearned back toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of whiplashes, and the dog swung in at the man's heels and followed after. The man took a chew of tobacco and proceeded to start a new amber beard. Also, his moist breath quickly powdered with white his mustache, eyebrows, and lashes. There did not seem to be so many springs on the left fork of the Henderson, and for half an hour the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At a place where there were no signs, where the soft unbroken snow seemed to advertise solidity beneath, the man broke through. It was not deep. He wetted himself halfway to the knees before he floundered out to the firm crust. He was angry and cursed his luck aloud. He had hoped to get into camp with the boys at 6 o'clock, and this would delay him an hour, for he would have to build a fire and dry out his footgear. This was imperative at that low temperature, he knew that much, and he turned aside to the bank, which he climbed. On top, tangled in the underbrush about the trunks of several small spruce trees, was a high-water deposit of dry firewood, sticks and twigs principally, but also large portions of seasoned branches and fine, dry, last year's grasses. He threw down several large pieces on top of the snow. This served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from drowning itself in the snow it otherwise would melt. The flame he got by touching a match to a small shred of birch bark that he took from his pocket. This burned even more readily than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with wisps of dry grass and with the tiniest dry twigs. He worked slowly and carefully, keenly aware of his danger. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, he increased the size of the twigs which he fed it. He squatted in the snow, pulling the twigs out from their entanglement in the brush and feeding directly to the flame. He knew there must be no failure. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. That is, if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile and restore his circulation. But the circulation of wet and freezing feet cannot be restored by running when it is 75 below. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze the harder. All this the man knew. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek had told him about it the previous fall, and now he was appreciating the advice. Already all sensation had gone out of his feet. To build the fire he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly gone numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pumping blood to the surface of his body and to all the extremities, but the instant he stopped, the action of the pump eased down. The cold of space smote the unprotected tip of the planet, and he, being on that unprotected tip, received the full force of the blow. The blood of his body recoiled before it. The blood was alive, like the dog, and like the dog it wanted to hide away and cover itself up from the fearful cold. So long as he walked 4 miles an hour, he pumped that blood willy-nilly to the surface, but now it ebbed away and sank down into the recesses of his body. The extremities were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze the faster, and his exposed fingers numbed the faster, though they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and cheeks were already freezing, while the skin of all his body chilled as it lost its blood. But he was safe. Toes and nose and cheeks would only be touched by the frost, for the fire was beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it with twigs the size of his finger. In another minute he would be able to feed it with branches the size of his wrist, and then he would remove his wet footgear, and while it dried, he would keep his naked feet warm by the fire, rubbing them at first, of course, with snow. The fire was a success. He was safe. He remembered the advice of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek, and smiled. The old-timer had been very serious in laying down the law that no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below. Well, here he was. He had had the accident, he was alone, and he had saved himself. Those old-timers were rather womanish, some of them, he thought. All a man had to do was keep his head, and he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone. But it was surprising, the rapidity with which his cheeks and nose were freezing. and he had not thought his fingers could go lifeless in so short a time. Lifeless they were, for he could scarcely make them move together to grip a twig, and they seemed remote from his body and from him. When he touched a twig he had to look and see whether or not he had hold of it. The wires were pretty well down between him and his finger ends. All of which counted for little. There was the fire, snapping and crackling and promising life with every dancing flame. He started to untie his moccasins. They were coated with ice. The thick German socks were like sheaths of iron halfway to the knees, and the moccasin strings were like rods of steel, all twisted and knotted as by some conflagration. For a moment he tugged with his numbed fingers. Then, realizing the folly of it, he drew his sheath-knife. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his own fault, or rather his mistake. He should not have built the fire under the spruce tree. He should have built it in the open. But it had been easier to pull the twigs from the brush and drop them directly on the fire. Now, the tree under which he had done this carried a weight of snow on its boughs. No wind had blown for weeks, and each bough was fully freighted. Each time he had pulled a twig, he had communicated a slight agitation to the tree, an imperceptible agitation so far as he was concerned, but an agitation sufficient to bring about the disaster. High up in the tree, one bough capsized its load of snow. This fell on the boughs beneath, capsizing them. This process continued, spreading out and involving the whole tree. It grew like an avalanche, and it descended without warning upon the man and the fire was blotted out. Where it had burned was a mantle of fresh and disordered snow. The man was shocked. It was as though he had just heard his own sentence of death. For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. Then he grew very calm. Perhaps the old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right. If he had only had a trail-mate, he would have been in no danger now. The trail-mate could have built the fire. Well, it was up to him to build the fire over again, and this second time there must be no failure. Even if he succeeded, he would most likely lose some toes. His feet must be badly frozen by now, and there would be some time before the second fire was ready. Such were his thoughts, but he did not sit and think them. He was busy all the time they were passing through his mind. He made a new foundation for a fire, this time in the open, where no treacherous tree could blot it out. Next he gathered dry grasses and tiny twigs from the high-water flotsam. He could not bring his fingers together to pull them out, but he was able to gather them by the handful. In this way he got many rotten twigs and bits of green moss that were undesirable, but it was the best he could do. He worked methodically, even collecting an armful of the larger branches to be used later when the fire gathered strength. And all the while the dog sat and watched him, a certain yearning wistfulness in its eyes, for it looked upon him as the fire-provider, and the fire was slow in coming. When all was ready, the man reached into his pocket for a second piece of birch bark. He knew the bark was there, and though he could not feel it with his fingers, he could hear its crisp rustling as he fumbled for it. Try as he would, he could not clutch hold of it, and all the time in his consciousness was the knowledge that at each instant his feet were freezing. This thought tended to put him in a panic, but he fought against it and kept calm. He pulled on his mittens with his teeth and thrashed his arms back and forth, beating his hands with all his might against his sides. He did this sitting down, and he stood up to do it, and all the while the dog sat in the snow, its wolf-brush of a tail curved around warmly over its forefeet, its sharp wolf-ears pricked forward intently as it watched the man. And the man, as he beat and threshed with his arms and legs, felt a great surge of envy as he regarded the creature that was warm and secure in its natural covering. After a time he was aware of the first far-away signals of sensation in his beaten fingers. The faint tingling grew stronger till it evolved into a stinging ache that was excruciating, but which the man hailed with satisfaction. He stripped the mitten from his right hand and fetched forth the birch bark. The exposed fingers were quickly going numb again. Next he brought out his bunch of sulphur matches, but the tremendous cold had already driven the life out of his fingers. In his effort to separate one match from the others, the whole bunch fell in the snow. He tried to pick it out of the snow, but failed. The dead fingers could neither touch nor clutch. He was very careful. He drove the thought of his freezing feet and nose and cheeks out of his mind, devoting his whole soul to the matches. He watched, using the sense of vision in place of that of touch, and when he saw his fingers on each side of the bunch, he closed them. That is, he willed to close them, for the wires were drawn and the fingers did not obey. He pulled the mitten on the right hand and beat it fiercely against his knee. Then, with both mittened hands, he scooped the bunch of matches, along with much snow, into his lap. Yet he was no better off. After some manipulation, he managed to get the bunch between the heels of his mittened hands. In this fashion he carried it to his mouth. The ice crackled and snapped, when by a violent effort he opened his mouth. He drew the lower jaw in, curled the upper lip out of the way, and scraped the bunch with his upper teeth in order to separate a match. He succeeded in getting one, which he dropped on his lap. He was no better off. He could not pick it up. Then he devised a way. He picked it up in his teeth and scratched it on his leg. 20 times he scratched before he succeeded in lighting it. As it flamed, he held it with his teeth to the birch bark. But the burning brimstone went up his nostrils and into his lungs, causing him to cough spasmodically. The match fell into the snow and went out. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right, he thought in the moment of controlled despair that ensued. After 50 below, a man should travel with a partner. He beat his hands, but failed in exciting any sensation. Suddenly he bared both hands, removing the mittens with his teeth. He caught the whole bunch between the heels of his hands. His arm muscles, not being frozen, enabled him to press the hand-heels tightly against the matches. Then he scratched the bunch along his leg. It flared into flame, 70 sulphur matches at once. There was no wind to blow them out. He kept his head to one side to escape the strangling fumes, and held the blazing bunch to the birch bark. As he so held it, he became aware of sensation in his hand. His flesh was burning. He could smell it. Deep down below the surface he could feel it. The sensation developed into pain that grew acute. And still he endured it, holding the flame of the matches clumsily to the bark that would not light readily, because his own burning hands were in the way, absorbing most of the flame. At last, when he could endure no more, he jerked his hands apart. The blazing matches fell sizzling into the snow, but the birch bark was alight. He began layering dry grasses and the tiniest twigs on the flame. He could not pick and choose, for he had to lift the fuel between the heels of his hands. Small pieces of rotten wood and green moss clung to the twigs, and he bit them off as well as he could with his teeth. He cherished the flame carefully and awkwardly. It meant life, and it must not perish. The withdrawal of blood from the surface of his body now made him begin to shiver, and he grew more awkward. A large piece of green moss fell squarely on the little fire. He tried to poke it out with his fingers, but his shivering frame made him poke too far, and he disrupted the nucleus of the little fire, the burning grasses and tiny twigs separating and scattering. He tried to poke them together again, but in spite of the tenseness of the effort, his shivering got away with him, and the twigs were hopelessly scattered. Each twig gushed a puff of smoke and went out. The fire-provider had failed. As he looked apathetically about him, his eyes chanced on the dog, sitting across the ruins of the fire from him in the snow, making restless, hunching movements, slightly lifting one forefoot and then the other, shifting its weight back and forth on them with wistful eagerness. The sight of the dog put a wild idea into his head. He remembered the tale of the man, caught in a blizzard, who killed a steer and crawled inside the carcass, and so was saved. He would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until the numbness went out of them. Then he could build another fire. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal, who had never known the man to speak in such way before. Something was the matter, and its suspicious nature sensed danger. It knew not what danger, but somewhere, somehow, in its brain arose an apprehension of the man. It flattened its ears down at the sound of the man's voice, and its restless hunching movements and the liftings and shiftings of its forefeet became more pronounced, but it would not come to the man. He got on his hands and knees and crawled toward the dog. This unusual posture again excited suspicion, and the animal sidled mincingly away. The man sat up in the snow for a moment and struggled for calmness. Then he pulled on his mittens by means of his teeth and got upon his feet. He glanced down at first in order to assure himself that he was really standing up, for the absence of sensation in his feet left him unrelated to the earth. His erect position in itself started to drive the webs of suspicion from the dog's mind, and when he spoke peremptorily, with the sound of whip-lashes in his voice, the dog rendered its customary allegiance and came to him. As it came within reaching distance, the man lost his control. His arms flashed out to the dog, and he experienced general surprise when he discovered that his hands could not clutch, that there was neither bend nor feeling in the fingers. He had forgotten for the moment that they were frozen, and that they were freezing more and more. All this happened quickly, and before the animal could get away, he encircled its body with his arms. He sat down in the snow, and in this fashion held the dog, while it snarled and whined and struggled. But it was all he could do, hold its body encircled in his arms and sit there. He realized that he could not kill the dog. There was no way to do it. With his helpless hands he could neither draw nor hold his sheath-knife, nor throttle the animal. He released it, and it plunged wildly away, with tail between its legs and still snarling. It halted 40 feet away and surveyed him curiously, with ears sharply pricked forward. The man looked down at his hands in order to locate them, and found them hanging on the ends of his arms. It struck him as curious that one should have to use his eyes in order to find out where his hands were. He began threshing his arms back and forth, beating the mittened hands against his sides. He did this for 5 minutes, violently, and his heart pumped enough blood up to the surface to put a stop to his shivering. But no sensation was aroused in the hands. He had an impression that they hung like weights on the ends of his arms, but when he tried to run the impression down, he could not find it. A certain fear of death, dull and oppressive, came to him. This fear quickly became poignant as he realized that it was no longer a mere matter of freezing his fingers and toes, or of losing his hands and feet, but it was a matter of life and death, with the chances against him. This threw him into a panic, and he turned and ran up the creek bed along the old dim trail. The dog joined in behind and kept up with him. He ran blindly, without intention, in fear such as he had never known in his life. Slowly, as he ploughed and floundered through the snow, He began to see things again, the banks of the creek, the old timber jams, the leafless aspens, and the sky. The running made him feel better. He did not shiver. Maybe, if he ran on, his feet would thaw out, and anyway, if he ran far enough, he would reach camp and the boys. Without doubt he would lose some fingers and toes, and some of his face, but the boys would take care of him and save the rest of him when he got there. And at the same time there was another thought in his mind that said he would never get to the camp and the boys, that it was too many miles away, that the freezing had too great a start on him, and that he would soon be stiff and dead. This thought he kept in the background and refused to consider. Sometimes it pushed itself forward and demanded to be heard, but he thrust it back and strove to think of other things. It struck him as curious that he could run at all on feet so frozen that he could not feel them when they struck the earth and took the weight of his body. He seemed to himself to skim along above the surface and to have no connection with the earth. Somewhere he had once seen a winged Mercury, and he wondered if Mercury felt as he felt when skimming over the earth. His theory of running until he reached camp and the boys had one flaw in it. He lacked the endurance. Several times he stumbled, and finally he tottered, crumpled up, and fell. When he tried to rise, he failed. He must sit and rest, he decided, and next time he would merely walk and keep on going. As he sat and regained his breath, he noted that he was feeling quite warm and comfortable. He was not shivering. It had even seemed that a warm glow had come to his chest and trunk. And yet, when he touched his nose or cheeks, there was no sensation. Running would not thaw them out, nor would it thaw out his hands and feet. Then the thought came to him that the frozen portions of his body must be extending. He tried to keep this thought down, to forget it, to think of something else. He was aware of the panicky feeling that it caused, and he was afraid of the panic. But the thought asserted itself and persisted until it produced a vision of his body totally frozen. This was too much, and he made another wild run along the trail. Once he slowed down to a walk, but the thought of the freezing extending itself made him run again. And all the time the dog ran with him, at his heels. When he fell down a second time, it curled its tail over its forefeet and sat in front of him, facing him, curiously eager and intent. The warmth and security of the animal angered him, and he cursed it till it flattened down its ears appeasingly. This time the shivering came more quickly upon the man. He was losing in his battle with the frost. It was creeping into his body from all sides. The thought of it drove him on, but he ran no more than 100 feet when he staggered and pitched headlong. It was his last panic. When he had recovered his breath and control, he sat up and entertained in his mind the conception of meeting death with dignity. However, the conception did not come to him in such terms. His idea of it was that he had been making a fool of himself, running around like a chicken with his head cut off. Such was the simile that occurred to him. Well, he was bound to freeze anyway, and he might as well take it decently. With his new-found peace of mind came the first glimmerings of drowsiness. A good idea, he thought, to sleep off to death. It was like taking an anesthetic. Freezing was not so bad as people thought. There were lots worse ways to die. He pictured the boys finding his body next day. Suddenly he found himself with them, coming along the trail and looking for himself. And, still with them, he came around a turn in the trail and found himself lying in the snow. He did not belong with himself any more, for even then he was out of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow. It certainly was cold, was his thought. When he got back to the States, he could tell the folks what real cold was. He drifted on from this to a vision of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly, warm and comfortable, smoking a pipe. "You were right, old hoss, you were right," the man mumbled to the old-timer of Sulphur Creek. Then the man drowsed off into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting. The brief day drew to a close in a long, slow twilight. There were no signs of a fire to be made, and, besides, never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. As the twilight drew on, its eager yearning for the fire mastered it, and with a great lifting and shifting of forefeet, it whined softly, then flattened its ears down in anticipation of being chidden by the man. But the man remained silent. Later the dog whined loudly, and still later it crept close to the man and caught the scent of death. This made the animal bristle and back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leaped and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and trotted up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew, where were the other food-providers and fire-providers. End of To Build a Fire, by Jack London.
The Urge by Maryland Allen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. She is now a woman ageless because she is famous. She is surrounded by a swarm of lovers and possesses a great many beautiful things. She has more than one Ming jar in the library at her country place. Yards upon yards of Pois de Venise lace in her top bureau drawer. She is able to employ a very pleasant, wholesome woman whose sole duty is to keep her clothes in order. She wears superb clothes, the last word in richness and the elegance of perfection. Clothes that no man can declaim over, stimulating himself the while with shot after shot of that most insidious of all dope, self-pity. You see, she earns them all herself, along with the Ming jars, the Pois de Venise, the country place, and countless other things. She is the funniest woman in the world. Not in her press agent's imagination, but in cold, sober fact. She can make anybody laugh. She does make everybody. Night after night, in the huge public theaters of the common people, in the small private ones of the commoner rich, in Greek amphitheaters where the laughter rolls away in thunderous waves to be echoed back by distant blue hills, in institutions for the blind, in convalescent wards, everywhere, every time, she makes them laugh. The day laborer, sodden and desperate from too much class legislation, the ego in his cosmos and the struggle for existence, the statesman, fearful of losing votes, rendered blue and depressed by the unruliness of nations and all the vast multitude of horrors that lie in between. All of these, all of them, she makes laugh. She is queen of the profession she has chosen, unusual for one of her sex. She is the funniest woman in the world. When she is at home, which is seldom, she has many visitors and strives, if possible, to see none of them. "You know, I entertain so much," she pleads in that vivid, whimsical way of hers that holds as much of sadness as mirth. But this time, it being so early in the afternoon, she was caught unawares. The girls, they were nothing but girls, 3 of them, found her out upon the lawn, sitting on a seat where the velvety green turf fell away in a steep hillside. And far beneath them they could see the river moving whitely beyond the trees. They halted there before her, happy but trembling, giggling but grave. They were gasping and incoherent, full of apologies and absurd tremors. It had taken their combined week's savings to bribe the gardener, and they only wanted to know one thing. How had she achieved all this fame and splendor? By what magic process had she become that rarest of all living creatures, the funniest woman in the world? It was an easy enough question to ask, and to them, hovering, twittering upon high heels, a trifle worn to one side, a simple one for her to answer. She looked at them in that humorous, kindly way of hers, looked at their silly, excited, made-up faces with noses sticking out stark like handles from a too-heavy application of purplish-white powder. Then her glance traveled down the velvety green slope to the bright river, glancing and leaping beyond the shady trees. Did she think of that other girl? Sitting there with that strange smile upon her face, the smile that is neither mirth nor sadness, but a poignant, haunting compound of both. Did she remember her and the urge that had always been upon her, racking her like actual pain, driving her with a whip of scorpions, flaying her on and on with a far more vivid sense of suffering than the actual beatings laid on her by her mother's heavy hand? The thing that found articulation in the words, "I must be famous, I must." She belonged in the rear of a batch of a dozen, and had never been properly named. The wind was blowing from the stockyards on the dark hour when she arrived. It penetrated even to the small, airless chamber where she struggled for her first breath, one of a flat in the poorest tenement in the worst slum in Chicago. Huddled in smelly rags by a hastily summoned neighbor from the floor above, the newcomer raised her untried voice in a frail, reedy cry. Perhaps she did not like the smell that oozed in around the tightly closed window to combat the foul odors of the airless room. Whatever it was, the protest availed her nothing, for the neighbor hurriedly departed, having been unwilling from the first, and the mother turned away and lay close against the stained, discolored wall, too apathetic, too utterly resigned to the fate life had meted out to her, to accord this most unwelcome baby further attention. This first moment of her life might easily serve as the history of her babyhood. Her father was also indifferent. He brought home his money and gave it to his wife. Children were strictly none of his business. Her brothers and sisters, each one busily and fiercely fending for himself, gave no attention to her small affairs. Tossed by the careless hand of fate into the dark sea of life to swim or perish, she awoke to consciousness with but one thought: food. One ruling passion: to get enough. And since, in her habitual half-starved state, all food looked superlatively good to her, cake was the first word she learned to speak. It formed her whole vocabulary for a surprisingly long time, and cake was the only name she was ever known by in her family circle, and on the street that to her ran on and on and on, as narrow and dirty, as crowded and as cruel as where it passed the great dilapidated old rookery that held the 4 dark rooms that she called home. Up to the age of 10, her life was sketchy. A passionate scramble for food. Beatings, tears, slumber, a swift transition from one childish ailment to another that kept her forever out of reach of the truant officer. She lay upon the floor in a little dark room, and through the window in the airless air shaft, high up in one corner, she could see a three-cornered spot of light. At first she wondered what it was, since she lived in a tenement not under the sky. Then it resolved itself into a ball, white and luminous, that floated remote in that high place that seemed to draw her, and was somehow akin to the queer, gnawing pain that developed about that time beneath her breastbone. It was all inarticulate, queer and confused. She did not think. She did not know how. She only felt that queer gnawing beneath her breastbone, distinct from all her other pains, and which she ascribed to hunger, and saw the lovely trembling globe of light. At first she felt it only when she was ill and lay on the tumbled floor bed and looked up through the dark window. Afterward, always in her dreams. After she passed her 10th birthday, the confusion within her seemed to settle as the queer pain increased, and she began to think, to wonder what it could be. A year or two later, her father died, and as she was the only child over whom her mother could exercise any control, the report of her death was successfully impressed upon the truant officer, so that she might be put to work unhindered to help the family in its desperate scramble for food, a scramble in which she took part with vivid earnestness. She was hired to Maverick's to wash dishes. Maverick was a Greek and kept an open all-night chop-house, a mean hole-in-the-wall 2 doors from the corner, where Cake's surpassing thinness made her invaluable at the sink. Also, the scraps she carried home in her red, water-puckered hands helped out materially. Then her mother took a boarder and rested in her endeavors, feeling she had performed all things well. This boarder was a man with a past, and he had left it pretty far behind, else he had never rented a room and meals from the mother of Cake. In this boarder, drink and debauchery had completely beaten out of shape what had once been a very noble figure of a man. His body was shrunken and trembling. The old ragged clothes he wore flapped about him like the vestments of a scarecrow. His cheeks had the bruised, congested look of the habitual drinker. His nose seemed a toadstool on his face, and his red eyes were almost vanished behind puffy, purple, pillow-like lids. His voice was husky and whispering, except when he raised it. Then it was surprisingly resonant and mellow, with something haunting in it, like the echo of a very moving sweetness. One night Cake, returning all weary and played out from dishwashing at Maverick's, heard him speaking in this loud voice of his, pushed the door open a crack, and peeked in. He was standing in the middle of the floor, evidently speaking what the child called to herself a piece. Her big mouth crooked derisively in the beginning of what is now her famous smile. The lodger went on speaking, being fairly well stimulated at the time, and presently Cake pushed the door wider and crept into the dry goods box, where her mother always kept a candle, and sat down. The lodger talked on and on while Cake sat rapt, the flickering candle in her hands, throwing strange lights and shadows upon her gaunt face. How was she to know she was the last audience of one of the greatest Shakespearean actors the world had ever seen? It was a grave and wondering Cake that crept to her place to sleep that night between her two older sisters, and while they ramped against her and chewed and snorted in her ears, she listened all over again to that wonderful voice and was awed by the color and beauty of the words that it had spoken. She slept and saw before her the globe of light, trembling and luminous, the one bright thing of beauty her life had ever known, that seemed to draw her up from darkness slowly and with great suffering. Trembling and weeping, she awoke in the dawn, and the strange pain that had tortured her so much and that she had called hunger and sought to assuage with scraps from the plates that came to the sink at Maverick's became articulate at last. With her hands clasped hard against her breast, she found relief in words. "I gotta be somebody," sobbed the child. "I must be famous. I must." She arose to find life no longer a confused struggle for food, but a battle and a march. A battle to get through one day to march on to the next, and so on and on until in that long line of days that stretched out ahead of her like chambers waiting to be visited, she reached the one where rested fame, that trembling, luminous globe of beauty it was so vitally necessary for her to achieve. "How come he can talk like that?" she demanded of herself, musing on the lodger's wonderful exhibition over the greasy dishwater at Maverick's. And that night she asked him, prefacing her question with the offering of an almost perfect lamb chop. Only one piece had been cut from it since the purchaser, at that moment apprised by Maverick himself that the arrival of the police was imminent, had taken a hasty departure. "Who learned you to talk that way?" demanded Cake, licking a faint, faraway flavor of the chop from her long, thin fingers. The lodger, for a moment, had changed places with the candle. That is to say, he sat upon the dry goods box. The candle burned upon the floor. And having been most unfortunate that day, the lodger was tragically sober. He bit into the chop voraciously, like a dog, with his broken, discolored teeth. "A book learned me," he said, "and practice and experience, and something else." He broke off short. "They called it genius then," he said bitterly. Cake took a short step forward. That thing beneath her prominent breastbone pained her violently, forced her on to speak. "You learn me," she said. The lodger ceased to chew and stared, the chop bone uplifted in his dirty hand. A pupil for him. "You want to do this, perhaps," he began. "Pray do not mock me. I'm a very foolish, fond old man." The disreputable, swollen-faced lodger, with a nose like a poisoned toadstool, vanished. Cake saw an old, white-haired man, crazy and pitiful, yet bearing himself grandly. She gasped. The tears flew to her eyes, blinding her. The lodger laughed disagreeably. He was gnawing on the chop bone again. "I suppose you think because you've found me here it is likely I'll teach you. You starved alley cat," he snarled. Kate did not even blink. It is repetition that dulls, and she was utterly familiar with abuse. "And suppose I did learn you," he sneered. "What would you do with it?" "I would be famous," cried Cake. Then the lodger did laugh, looking at her with his head hanging down, his swollen face all creased and purple, his hair sticking up rough and unkempt. He laughed, sitting there a degraded, debauched ruin, looking down from the height of his memories upon the gaunt, unlovely child of the slums, who was rendered even more unlovely by the very courage that kept her waiting beside the broken door. "So you think I could learn you to be famous, eh?" Even the words of this gutter filth he sought to construe into something mattering to himself. Kate nodded. Really, she had not thought of it that way at all, and there was no thinking connected with her decision. The dumb hours she had spent staring up at the air shaft had resolved themselves with the passing years into a strange, numb will to do. There was the light, and she must reach it. Indeed, the thing there behind the narrow walls of her chest gave her no alternative. She did not think she wanted to be an actress. It was a long time after that before she even knew what an actress was. She did not know what the lodger had been. No, instinctively, groping and inarticulate, she recognized in him the rags and shreds of greatness, knew him to be a one-time dweller in that temple whither, willing or not, she was bound, to reach it or to die. The lodger looked down at the naked chop bone in his hand. The juicy broiled meat was comforting to his outraged stomach. Meat. The word stood out in his mind, to be instantly followed by that other word that, for him, had spelled ruin, made him a ragged panhandler, reduced him to living among the poorest and most hopeless. Drink. He raised his head and eyed Cake with crafty calculation. "What will you pay me for such teaching?" he demanded, and looked down again at the bone. What he did in the end, Cake herself was satisfied, came to him afterward. At first he was actuated only by the desire to procure food and drink, more especially the drink, at the cost of the least possible effort to himself. Cake saw the look, and she knew. She even smiled a little in the greatness of her relief. She saw she had been right to bring the chop, and appreciated that her progress along the road to fame would be as slow or fast as she could procure food for him in lesser or larger quantities. "I'll bring you eats," she said cunningly. "From Mavericks," she added, by which she meant the eats would be has-is, distinctly second class, quite possibly third. The lodger nodded. "And booze," he put in, watching her face. Booze," Cake assented. So the bargain was struck in a way that worked the most cruel hardship on the girl. Food she could steal, and did, blithely enough, since she had no monitor but the lure of brightness and that thing within her breast that hotly justified the theft and only urged her on. But booze was a very different proposition. It was impossible to steal booze, even a little. To secure booze, she was forced to offer money. Now, what money Cake earned at Maverick's, her mother snatched from her hand before she was well within the door. If she held out even a dime, she got a beating, and Cake's mother, in the later years of her life, besides being a clever evader of the police and the truant officer, developed into a beater of parts. Broken food the child offered in abundance and piteous hope, but the lodger was brutally indifferent. "Food," he scoffed. "Why, it says in the Bible." "You never heard of the Bible, hey?" Cake shook her tangled head. "No? Well, it's quite a book," commented the lodger. He had been fortunate that day and was, for him, fairly intoxicated. "And it says right in there, and some consider that book an authority, man cannot live by food alone. Drink. I drink when I have occasion, and sometimes when I have no occasion. Don't you know what drink is, alley cat? Very well, then. Wine is wont to show the mind of man, and you Won't see mine until you bring me booze. Get out!" And Cake got out. Also, being well versed in a very horrid wisdom, she took the food with her. This was hardly what the lodger had expected, and I think what respect he was capable of sprouted for her then. Behind a screen of barrels in the corner of the alley, Cake ate the broken meats herself, taking what comfort she could, and pondering the while the awful problem of securing the booze, since she must be taught, and since the lodger moved in her sphere as the only available teacher. There was a rush up the alley past her hiding place, a shout, and the savage thud of blows. Very cautiously, as became one wise in the ways of that place, Cake peered around a barrel. She saw Red Dan, who sold papers in front of Jeer Dooley's place, thoroughly punishing another and much larger boy. The bigger boy was crying. "Anybody can sell papers," shouted Red Dan, pounding the information home bloodily. "You hear me? Anybody!" Cake crept out of her hiding place on the opposite side. She did not care what happened to the bigger boy, though she respected Red Dan the more. She knew where the money was going to come from to buy the lodger's booze. It meant longer hours for her. It meant care, to work only out of school hours. It meant harder knocks than even she had experienced. It meant a fatigue there were no words to describe even among the beautiful, wonderful, colorful ones the lodger taught her. But she sold the papers and she purchased the booze. Her mother did not know where she spent this extra time. She did not care, since the money came in from Maverick steadily each week. Neither did the lodger care how the booze was procured. The big thing to him was that it came. At first, these lessons were fun for him. The big, gawky, half-starved, overworked child, seeing so vividly in pictures all that he told her in words. Full-fed on the scraps from Mavericks, he was no longer fastidious, well stimulated by the drink she bought. He took an ugly sort of degraded pleasure in posturing before her, acting as he alone could act, those most wonderful of all plays, watching with hateful, sardonic amusement the light and shadow of emotion upon her dirty face. Oh, he was a magician, no doubt at all of that, past master in the rare art of a true genius, that of producing illusion. And then he would make Cake try, rave at her, curse her, strike her, kill himself laughing, drink some more, and put her at it again. Night after night, almost comatose with the fatigue of a day that began while it was still dark, she carried a heaped-up plate and a full bottle to the lodger's room and sat down upon the dry goods box with the candle beside her on the floor. And having thus secured her welcome, night after night she walked with him among the greatest of all throngs of soldiers and lovers, kings and cardinals, queens, prostitutes and thieves. If the liquor was short in the bottle a dime's worth, the lesson was curtailed. At first Cake tried to coax him. Come on, you're Romeo on the street in Mantua. But the lodger was never so drunk that he made the slightest concession. Yes, I'm Romeo, all right. The lads there never fear gutter snipe. But the bottle is not full. After that she never attempted to change his ruling. She was letter perfect in the bitter lesson, and if the sale of papers did not bring in enough to fill the bottle, she accepted the hard fact with the calm of great determination, and did not go near the lodger's room, but went to bed instead. Perhaps it was these rare occasions of rest that kept her alive. After the lodger had been teaching her for several years, her mother died and was buried in the potter's field. Cake managed to keep 2 rooms of the wretched flat, and no word of his landlady's demise reached the lodger's drink-dulled ears. Otherwise, Cake feared he might depart, taking with him her one big chance to reach the light. You see, she did not know the lodger. Things might have been different if she had. But he was never a human being to her, even after she knew the truth. Only a symbol, a means to the great end. Her brothers went away, to the penitentiary and other places. One by one the flood of life caught her sisters and swept them out. She did not know to what. She never even wondered. She had not been taught to care. She had never been taught anything. The knowledge that she must be famous danced through her dreams like a will-o'-the-wisp, had grown within her in the shape of a great pain that never ceased, only eased a little as she strove mightily toward the goal. So she still sold papers, a homely, gawky, long-legged girl in ragged clothes much too small for her, enslaved at Maverick's for the lodger's nightly dole that he might teach her and she be famous. At first he was keen on the meat and drink, more especially the drink. Later, gradually, a change came over him. Only Cake did not notice this change. She was too set on being taught so she could become famous. At first, the lodger was all oaths and blows, with shouts of fierce, derisive laughter intermingled. "My God," he would cry, "if Noyes could only see this, if he only could." This Noyes, it appeared, was a man he furiously despised. When he was in the 3rd stage of drunkenness, he would never teach Cake, but would only abuse his enemies. And this Noyes inevitably came in for a fearful shower of epithets. It was he, as Cake heard it, sitting huddled on the dry goods box, the candle casting strange shadows into her gaunt, unchildlike face, who was the cause of the lodger's downfall. But for Noyes, with a blasting array of curses before the name, he would now have what Cake so ardently strove for, fame. But for Noyes he would be acting in his own theater, riding in his own limousine, wearing his own diamonds, entertaining his own friends upon his own gold plate. When he was still too sober to take a really vital interest in the teaching, he was a misanthrope, bitter and brutal, with an astonishing command of the most terrible words. At these times he made the gravest charges against Noyes, charges for which the man should be made accountable, even to such a one as the lodger. One evening Cake sat watching him, waiting for this mood to pass so that the teaching might begin. "If I was yous," she said at last, "and hated a guy like yous do this Noyes, I'd fetch him an insult that'd get under his skin right. I'd make evens with him. I would. Not just talk about it." "Oh, you would," remarked the lodger. He took a long pull at the bottle. "You be Queen Catherine, you alley cat." So the nightly teaching began with the usual accompaniment of curses, blows, and shouts of brutal laughter. But when it was over, and the lodger was sinking to the 3rd stage that came inevitably with the bottom of the bottle, he kept looking at his pupil queerly. "Oh, you would. Oh, you would you?" He said it over and over again. "Oh, you would you?" And after that he was changed by the leaven of hate her suggestion had started working in him. For one thing, he took a far greater interest in the teaching for its own sake. Of that much the girl herself was thankfully aware. And she thought, Cake did, that the dull husk of self was wearing away from that part of her destined to be famous. Wearing away at last. The lodger's curses changed in tone as the nights filed past. The blows diminished. The laughter became far more frequent. Cake, as rapidly reaching the end of her girlhood as the lodger was nearing the limits of his drink-sapped strength, redoubled her efforts. It was very plain to her that he could not live much longer. Death in delirium tremens was inevitable. After that, she decided, school would not keep, and she must try her fortune. Then one night in the midst of the potion scene, when she felt herself Juliet, soft, passionate, and beautiful, far away in the land of tragic romance, she heard the lodger crying, "Stop! My God, stop! How do you get that way? Don't you know there's a limit to human endurance, alley cat?" He was fairly toppling from the dry goods box. His eyes were popping from his head, and in the flickering candlelight his face looked strained and queer. In after life she became very familiar with that expression. She saw it on all types of faces. In fact, she came to expect to see it there. But she did not know how to analyze it then. She glimpsed it only as a tribute to her performance, so immense that she had to be halted in the middle and felt correspondingly elated. She was exactly right in her deduction. But Cake and the lodger advanced along very different lines of thought. The next night he was shaky, came all too quickly to the teaching period, and left it as speedily. Then he retired to the flock mattress in the corner of the room and called Cake to bring the candle. "I've an idea I'm going to leave you, guttersnipe," he said, "and I doubt if I ever see you again. The end of life cancels all bonds. And the one that bound you to me, alley cat, was very material indeed. The kind that runs easily in and out of a black bottle." He laughed. "You Shakespearean actress," he laughed again, longer this time. "But I have not forgotten you," he resumed. "In addition to all that I have taught you, I'm going to leave you something. Here." He fumbled out a square envelope, and Cake took it between her hands. "Take that to the address written on it," said the lodger, "and see what the gentleman does." He began to laugh again. "No, yes," he cried, and broke off to curse feebly but volubly. Cake did not even glance in his direction. She went away out of the room, too utterly stunned with fatigue to look at the letter in her dingy hand. The next morning the lodger was dead. He was buried in the potter's field quite near his old landlady. This second funeral, such as it was, closed the shelter that Cake, for want of a more fitting name, had called home. She decided to put all her years of bitterly acquired learning to the test, and as she best knew what she had bought and paid for it, she felt she could not fail. She unfolded from a scrap of newspaper the envelope presented her by the lodger and carefully studied the address. Cake could both read and write, having acquired these arts from a waiter at Maverick's, who also helped her steal the broken meats with which she secured her artistic education. And watching the steady disappearance of the food, this waiter marveled that she got no fatter as she grew upward, hovering about in hope of becoming her lover, if she ever did. But even if that miracle had ever been accomplished, the helpful waiter would still have waited. Cake's conception of a real lady was Queen Catherine. Cleopatra, her dream of a dangerous, fascinating one. And what chance in the world for either with a waiter? Cake read the name and address upon the envelope freely, as the hopeful breadcaster had taught her. Arthur Payson Noyes, National Theatre. With the simplicity and dispatch that characterized her, she went to that place. To the man reposing somnolently in the broken old chair beside the door, she said she had a letter for Mr. Noyes. The doorkeeper saw it was a large, swanking envelope with very polite writing. He straightened up in the chair long enough to pass her in, and then slumped down again. Cake found herself in a queer barn-like place, half room and half hallway, feebly illumined by a single electric bulb suspended above the door. Very composedly she looked about her. If Mr. Arthur Noyes lived in this place, he was one of her own kind, and there was no need for any palpitation on her part. Anyway, she was looking solely for her chance to become famous, and she brought to this second stage of her search the same indifference to externals, the same calm, unfaltering courage as she had to the first. "Now then," said a voice briskly, "say what you want. We have not advertised for any extra people, at least not this year." A short, stout man emerged from the shadows. He was very blond, with his hair cut snapper, and his pale eyes popped perpetual astonishment. She returned his look steadily and well. She knew she was born to be famous, and fame has a certain beauty of dignity utterly lacking in mere success. "I am not an extra person," she replied. "I have come to see Mr. Noyes," and he displayed once more the large square envelope, her legacy from the lodger. The knife with which she proposed to shuck from its rough shell that oyster, the world. The man looked even more astonished, if the thing could have been accomplished, and regarded her keenly, stared. "Come this way," he said. Cake followed him up a long, narrow passage that turned off to the right, down 5 steps, across a narrow entry, up 3 more steps. Although it seems quite silly, she never in her life forgot the odd number of those worn steps, and halted before a closed door. On this the fat man knocked once and opened immediately without waiting. "Someone I think you'll see," he said, standing between Cake and the interior. There came to her a murmur over his chunky shoulder. "She has a letter from—" The fat man dropped his voice and mumbled. "Positive," he said aloud. After a pause, broken only by the vague murmur within the room, "I'd know his fist anywhere. Yes." And then he pushed the door open wide, stood aside, and looked at Cake. "Walk in," he said. She did so, beautifully. Poems have been written about her walk. 2 kinds. The room she entered was square, with concrete floor and rough walls. But Cake did not notice the room for 3 reasons: the rug on the floor, 4 pictures on the walls, and the man who looked at her as she entered. They gazed at each other, Cake and this man, with sudden, intense concentration. He was a genius in his line, she as surely one in hers. And instinctively, to that strange, bright flame, each rendered instant homage. What he saw, he described long afterward, when a million voices were vociferously raised in a million different descriptions. What she saw she likened in her mind to a dark sheath from which a sword flashed gloriously. That sword was his soul. "He says your name is Plain Cake. Is that true?" He referred to the lodger's letter held open in his hand, and by that she knew he was Arthur Noyes. and great. That last she had not needed any telling. "Yes," she replied. "He says you are the right Shakespearean actress for me." Noyes referred to the letter again. "Do you know Shakespeare?" "All the way," said Cake. It was not quite the answer Queen Catherine might have made, perhaps, but her manner was perfect. "Come here." He pointed to the center of the rapturous rug. "And do the potion scene for me." Cake stepped forward. "Perhaps you have been so fortunate as to see her. If so, you know that the step forward is her only preparation." She was poised. She was gone. And then suddenly she heard the lodger's voice crying, "Stop! My God, stop! How do you get that way? Don't you know there's a limit to human endurance, alley cat?" She broke off, staring confusedly into space, just the height of his debauched old figure crouching on the dry goods box. Then, with swift realization of her surroundings, her vision cleared. It was the fat man in the checked suit she saw leaning helplessly against the closed door. His jaw sagged. His eyes were frightfully popped. His face wore the same strained, queer look she had come to see so often on the lodgers, and he made weak little flapping gestures with his hands. Cake looked then at Arthur Noyes. His face was white as the letter in his hand. His dark eyes were dilated with a look of dreadful suffering, the numb, unconscious reaction of one who has received a mortal blow. "Come here, Crum," he cried, as if there was no one else in the room, and Crum fairly tottered forward. "What do you make of this?" asked Noyes, while Cake stood and listened. I stammered Crum exhaustedly. "My God," he groaned, "it's too much for me. And training." "Oh, trained," Cake heard Noyes say. "Such training as only he could give. Years of it, that's plain. And then to send her to me, a Shakespearean actress, for me, to insult me like that." "It's too much for me, boss," said Crum again, still. Oh, my." His back was turned, but Cake saw his whole body shake. "Telephone Meyer," exclaimed Noyes suddenly. "Meyer?" Crum became immediately composed, and Cake saw that he was tremendously surprised. "You don't mean that you're going to, after this?" "Why, she's in the know. Look at her. It's perfect." And they both turned and looked at Cake, standing unconscious and serene on the other side of the room. You who have seen her know just how perfect the pose was. "It is perfect," Noyes said. "I'd be a pretty poor sport if I did not acknowledge that." And then his voice dropped, and Cake only caught snatches here and there. "Such genius. Once in a century. Get even with him in a way he least expects. Wipe off the slate entirely. Now come back to my play. Let him see that for himself. Call Meyer." And then he turned to Cake. "Sit down, please," he said courteously. "I have sent for a man who may give you an engagement." She returned his gaze so quietly that he was puzzled. About her was neither nervous anticipation nor flighty vivacity. The actions of her audience of two left her incurious and calm. You see, she was used to the lodger. Also, she had worked to be famous so long that all the flowery borders of self were worn down to the keen edge of doing. Of plain Cake she thought not at all. But then she never had. Only of the light at the end of the passage that now loomed so bright to her watching eyes. It seemed only a minute before Noyes spoke again. "This is Mr. Meyer." He regarded her shrewdly all the time. Cake bowed to Mr. Meyer, a fat, gaudy gentleman with thick, hairy hands. And Mr. Meyer looked at Noyes and shook his head. She realized they had already been talking together. Never before, Mr. Meyer said. If you'll repeat the potion scene, Arthur Noyes suggested. This time I trust you will not be interrupted, he added politely. And Cake stepped once more into that rich orgy of emotion. This time, though dimly aware of noise and a confusion of shouting, she carried the scene through to the end. Romeo, I come. This do I drink to thee. And she lay for a moment where she had fallen, close to the heavenly colors of the rug. Good God, gasped Mr. Meyer, and Cake sat up. She saw he was rather collapsed upon a chair near which he had been standing up when she began. His fat face was purple, and tears stood in his eyes. But Arthur Noyes had not changed. White, with that look of mortal hurt, he still stood straight and slim against the table. You cannot offer her less than 200 a week to begin, he said with the same air of being alone with Mr. Meyer. No, sighed Mr. Meyer, wiping his eyes. He rose and bowed to Cake with the queerest respect, still wiping his eyes with the back of his thick, hairy hands. It was a striking commentary upon her years of training that both these men, successful from long and hard experience, paid her the compliment of thinking her an old hand at the game. Mine is the Imperial Theater, miss, said Meyer. You should be there tonight by 7 o'clock. It ain't necessary we should rehearse. No. And now, perhaps, he looked her up and down oddly, perhaps I can take you to your hotel? Cake looked him back, serene in her belief in what the lodger had taught her. I'll be there at 7, she said. No, thank you. She walked out and across into a small park where she sat until the appointed time. Then she went to the stage entrance of the Imperial Theater, presented the card Mr. Meyer had given her, and entered. Once inside, she was taken to a dressing room by a fat, comfortable, middle-aged woman who seemed to be waiting for her. After a very short and, to Cake, tranquil period, Mr. Meyer bustled in. Of course, miss, you know this is a review, he explained, rubbing his hands with a deference that Cake shed utterly because she did not know it was there. She nodded, accepting his statement. We make 'em laugh here, said Mr. Meyer. Again Cake nodded. She knew exactly as much about the show as she did before. You close the second act. It's the best place for you. Leafy here will help you dress. Cake sat still while Leafy dressed her, very hushed and still. The light blazed so near after all these hard, lean years of pursuit, years in which the little affairs of life, like the business of growing from a child to a woman, had simply passed her by. Of that urge to be famous she was even more burningly aware. Herself she did not know at all. Mr. Meyer came and took her by the hand. His fat face was pale and sweating. He seemed almost awestruck by Cake's calm. He drew her out of the dressing room and through a crowd of people, men and women with painted faces, some beautifully, some extravagantly and strangely dressed. They all stared. One woman shook her head. A man said, "Search me, I never saw her before." Then Mr. Meyer thrust her out into the face of a bright light. "Begin," he said hoarsely. "Walk over there and begin." Quietly, Cake obeyed. She had walked right into the bright light that had drawn her so hard and so long. Of course it was time for her to begin. And with this bright light in her face, which soon became to her the candle in that dark room left so far behind, she fared away to the magic land of beautiful make-believe. And only when Juliet, that precocious child, sank down poisoned did she become aware of the uproar about her, the shouts of the lodger. "Stop! My God, stop! How do you get that way?" Augmented 1,000,000 times. It was this she heard. Slowly Cake lifted herself on her hands. Dazedly she peered through the heart of the great light that had caused her such suffering and that she had followed faithfully so bitterly long. On the other side she saw faces, rows and rows of them, mounting up to the very roof. Faces laughing, faces convulsed, streaming with tears, faces with eyes fixed and wearing that same queer, strained look she had noticed before. Hundreds of faces, topping each other over in semicircular rows, all different but all alike, and that they were all laughing. She rose to her knees and rested there on all fours, staring. Laughter. A great clapping of hands rolled about her like thunder, dying down and rising again to even greater volume. Cries of "Go on!" assailed her ears, mingled with "Stop! Stop! I can't bear it!" The curtain fell before her, blotting out the vision of those faces, making the uproar slightly dimmer. Mr. Meyer advanced and lifted her to her feet. He moved weakly, exhausted with mirth. "Even Noyes," he gasped. He can't help it. Oh, my good God!" Kate looked away from him to the men and women that thronged about her. The same faces that had turned to her such a short while ago. But now, how different. "Oh, don't criticize," one woman cried. "Hand it to her. She can't be beat. She's the one that comes once in a century to show the rest of us what really can be done." "Meyer!" shouted a man. "Meyer! She'll have to go back, Meyer. She's stopped the show." Quiet and very still, Cake drew away. It seemed to her only a moment later that Leafy touched her arm. "Mr. Meyer has taken a suite for you here in this hotel," she said. "Can't you eat a little, miss?" Eat? She had never had enough to eat in her life. Her life? She had spent her life securing food for the lodger that he might teach her to be famous. Leafy lifted the spoon of hot soup to her lips, and immediately she drank. She who had never had enough to eat in her life, morsel by morsel, from the bountifully filled table the kindly dresser fed her. Obediently she ate, and the hot, rich food stimulated her to swifter, more agonizing thought. And then for the first time she saw Arthur Noyes standing with his back against the closed door. She read pity in his eyes, comprehension, great wonder. And what she did not know then was the love that came to a rare perfection between them and has never faded, and has no place in this story. "Will you tell me," he said, "what your name is, where your home is, and who are those that love you there?" Then he broke off and shrank a little against the door. "Oh, don't!" he protested. Yet she had only looked at him and smiled. But it came to her keenly in her new awareness that his questions covered the whole of a woman's life. Her name, her home, and the ones that loved her there. Well, she had no name. She did not even know the lodger's name. She looked down with strange astonishment at her grown-up figure, her woman's hands. She saw herself a ragged, gaunt, bushy-headed child moving on a tightrope above a dark abyss, intent only upon a luminous globe floating just out of reach ahead of her, that she stretched out for eagerly with both her hands. Suddenly the lovely bubble burst, and the child was a woman, falling and falling among rows of convulsed, shining white faces to the sound of gargantuan laughter. "You tell me," Arthur Noyes pleaded gently, and she did so, very simply and beautifully. She did know Shakespeare. It was the only English that she had ever been taught. So Noyes heard how she became an instrument in the hands of the man who hated him mortally, and owed her debut and her terrible awakening to what he considered the only sporting answer to that insult. While he listened, he pondered, awestruck, upon the fact that out of all this muck and blackness, the degradation of hate by the lodger, the refinement of hate by himself, had flowered that rarest of all human creatures, one that could make the whole world laugh. "He always hated me," he said. "I told him he had traded his genius for drink, and he never forgave me. Where is he now?" "Now?" Cake looked up at him in startled wonder. It came over her suddenly that he counted upon the lodger's being in the Imperial Theater that night. "Now?" she repeated. "Why, he's dead." It took Noyes a minute to recover. "What will you do?" he asked her. "Will you go on from the start, continue this sort of success?" He felt it the basest of cruelty, in the face of her story, to say it was the only kind she was ever destined to make. He waited for her answer, wondering, and a little awestruck. It seemed to him they had come to the supreme test of her genius. As she looked up at him with such sadness and such mirth, such tragic, humorous appreciation of the darkness in which she had been born, the toilsome way she had traveled to the great light, and what it actually revealed when she arrived. "I will go on from this success," she said. Involuntarily she raised her hand to her breast. "I must, since it is the only way for me, you see," with a humor far more touching than the saddest tears. "I must be famous." And she smiled that smile that hurt him, the smile the world loves and will give anything to see. The most famous fun-maker of her time looked away from the bright river fleeting beyond the trees to her giggling, half-terrified visitors. "Fame," she said, "is a secret that cannot be told. It must be discovered by the seeker. Let me offer you tea as a substitute." End of The Urge by Maryland Allen. Read by mystery teacher Michael Everding.
Walter Schnaffs' Adventure by Guy de Maupassant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bob Neufeld. Ever since he entered France with the invading army, Walter Schnaffs had considered himself the most unfortunate of men. He was large, had difficulty in walking, was short of breath, and suffered frightfully with his feet, which were very flat and very fat. But he was a peaceful, benevolent man, not warlike or sanguinary, the father of 4 children whom he adored, and married to a little blonde whose little tendernesses, attentions, and kisses he recalled with despair every evening. He liked to rise late and retire early, to eat good things in a leisurely manner, and to drink beer in the saloon. He reflected, besides, that all that is sweet in existence vanishes with life, and he maintained in his heart a fearful hatred, instinctive as well as logical, for cannon, rifles, revolvers, and swords, but especially for bayonets, feeling that he was unable to dodge this dangerous weapon rapidly enough to protect his big paunch. And when night fell and he lay on the ground, wrapped in his cape beside his comrades who were snoring, he thought long and deeply about those he had left behind and of the dangers in his path. If he were killed, what would become of the little ones? Who would provide for them and bring them up? Just at present they were not rich, although he had borrowed when he left so as to leave them some money. And Walter Schnaffs wept when he thought of all this. At the beginning of a battle his legs became so weak that he would have fallen if he had not reflected that the entire army would pass over his body. The whistling of the bullets gave him goose-flesh. For months he had lived thus in terror and anguish. His company was marching on Normandy, and one day he was sent to reconnoitre with a small detachment, simply to explore a portion of the territory and to return at once. All seemed quiet in the country. Nothing indicated an armed resistance. But as the Prussians were quietly descending into a little valley traversed by deep ravines, a sharp fusillade made them all halt suddenly, killing 20 of their men, and a company of sharpshooters, suddenly emerging from a little wood as large as your hand, darted forward with bayonets at the end of their rifles. Walter Schnaffs remained motionless at first, so surprised and bewildered that he did not even think of making his escape. Then he was seized with a wild desire to run away, but he remembered at once that he ran like a tortoise compared with those thin Frenchmen, who came bounding along like a lot of goats. Perceiving a large ditch full of brushwood covered with dead leaves about 6 paces in front of him, he sprang into it with both feet together, without stopping to think of its length, just as one jumps from a bridge into the river. He fell like an arrow through a thick layer of vines and thorny brambles that tore his face and hands, and landed heavily in a sitting posture on a bed of stones. Raising his eyes, he saw the sky through the hole he had made in falling through. This aperture might betray him, and he crawled along carefully on hands and knees at the bottom of this ditch beneath the covering of interlacing branches, going as fast as he could and getting away from the scene of the skirmish. Presently he stopped and sat down, crouched like a hare amid the tall dry grass. He heard firing and cries and groans going on for some time. Then the noise of fighting grew fainter and ceased. All was quiet and silent. Suddenly something stirred beside him. He was frightfully startled. It was a little bird which had perched on a branch and was moving the dead leaves. For almost an hour Walter Schnaff's heart beat loud and rapidly. Night fell, filling the ravine with its shadows. The soldier began to think. What was he to do? What was to become of him? Should he rejoin the army? But how? By what road? And he began over again the horrible life of anguish, of terror, of fatigue and suffering that he had led since the commencement of the war. No, he no longer had the courage. He would not have the energy necessary to endure long marches and to face the danger to which one was exposed at every moment. But what should he do? He could not stay in this ravine in concealment until the end of hostilities. No, indeed. If it were not for having to eat, this prospect would not have daunted him greatly. But he had to eat every day. And here he was, alone, armed and in uniform, on the enemy's territory, far from those who would protect him. A shiver ran over him. All at once he thought, "If I were only a prisoner!" And his heart quivered with a longing, an intense desire to be taken prisoner by the French. A prisoner, he would be saved, fed, housed, sheltered from bullets and swords, without any apprehension whatever, in a good, well-kept prison. A prisoner! What a dream! His resolution was formed at once. I will constitute myself a prisoner. He rose, determined to put this plan into execution without a moment's delay. But he stood motionless, suddenly a prey to disturbing reflections and fresh terrors. Where would he make himself a prisoner, and how? What direction? And frightful pictures of death came into his mind. He would run terrible danger in venturing alone through the country with his pointed helmet. Supposing he would meet some peasants. These peasants, seeing a Prussian who had lost his way, an unprotected Prussian, would kill him as if he were a stray dog. They would murder him with their forks, their picks, their scythes, and their shovels. They would make a stew of him, a pie, with the frenzy of exasperated, conquered enemies. If he should meet the sharpshooters, these sharpshooters, madmen without law or discipline, would shoot him just for amusement to pass an hour. It would make them laugh to see his head. And he fancied he was already leaning against a wall in front of 4 rifles, whose little black apertures seemed to be gazing at him. Supposing he should meet the French army itself? The vanguard would take him for a scout, for some bold and sly trooper who had set off alone to reconnoitre, and they would fire at him. And he could already hear, in imagination, the irregular shots of soldiers lying in the brush, while he himself, standing in the middle of the field, was sinking to the earth, riddled like a sieve with bullets which he felt piercing his flesh. He sat down again in despair. His situation seemed hopeless. It was quite a dark, black, and silent night. He no longer budged, trembling at all the slight and unfamiliar sounds that occur at night. The sound of a rabbit crouching at the edge of his burrow almost made him run. The cry of an owl caused him positive anguish, giving him a nervous shock that pained like a wound. He opened his big eyes as wide as possible to try and see through the darkness, and he imagined every moment that he heard someone walking close beside him. After interminable hours in which he suffered the tortures of the damned, he noticed through his leafy cover that the sky was becoming bright. He at once felt an intense relief. His limbs stretched out, suddenly relaxed, his heart quieted down, his eyes closed, he fell asleep. When he awoke, the sun appeared to be almost at the meridian. It must be noon. No sound disturbed the gloomy silence. Walter Schnaffs noticed that he was exceedingly hungry. He yawned, his mouth watering at the thought of sausage, the good sausage the soldiers have, and he felt a gnawing at his stomach. He rose from the ground, walked a few steps, found that his legs were weak, and sat down to reflect. For 2 or 3 hours he again considered the pros and cons, changing his mind every moment, baffled, unhappy, torn by the most conflicting motives. Finally he had an idea that seemed logical and practical. It was to watch for a villager passing by alone, unarmed and with no dangerous tools of his trade, and to run to him and give himself up, making him understand that he was surrendering. He took off his helmet, the point of which might betray him, and put his head out of his hiding-place with the utmost caution. No solitary pedestrian could be perceived on the horizon. Yonder, to the right, smoke rose from the chimney of a little village, smoke from kitchen fires. And yonder, to the left, he saw at the end of an avenue of trees a large turreted château. He waited till evening, suffering frightfully from hunger, seeing nothing but flights of crows, hearing nothing but the silent expostulation of his empty stomach. And darkness once more fell on him. He stretched himself out in his retreat, and slept a feverish sleep, haunted by nightmares, the sleep of a starving man. Dawn again broke above his head. and he began to make his observations. But the landscape was deserted as on the previous day, and a new fear came into Walter Schnaff's mind, the fear of death by hunger. He pictured himself lying at full length on his back at the bottom of his hiding-place, with his 2 eyes closed, and animals, little creatures of all kinds, approached and began to feed on his dead body, attacking it all over at once, gliding beneath his clothing to bite his cold flesh, and a big crow pecked out his eyes with its sharp beak. He almost became crazy, thinking he was going to faint and would not be able to walk, and he was just preparing to rush off to the village, determined to dare anything, to brave everything, when he perceived 3 peasants walking to the fields with their forks across their shoulders, and he dived back into his hiding-place. But as soon as it grew dark, he slowly emerged from the ditch and started off, stooping and fearful, with beating heart, towards the distant chateau, preferring to go there rather than to the village, which seemed to him as formidable as a den of tigers. The lower windows were brilliantly lighted. One of them was open, and from it escaped a strong odour of roast meat, an odour which suddenly penetrated to the olfactories and to the stomach of Walter Schnaffs, tickling his nerves, making him breathe quickly, attracting him irresistibly, and inspiring his heart with the boldness of desperation. And abruptly, without reflection, he placed himself, helmet on head, in front of the window. 8 servants were at dinner around a large table. But suddenly one of the maids sat there, her mouth agape, her eyes fixed and letting fall her glass. They all followed the direction of her gaze. They saw the enemy. Good God! The Prussians were attacking the chateau. There was a shriek, only one shriek made up of 8 shrieks uttered in 8 different keys, a terrific screaming of terror. Then a tumultuous rising from their seats, a jostling, a scrimmage, and a wild rush to the door at the farther end. Chairs fell over. The men knocked the women down and walked over them. In 2 seconds the room was empty, deserted, and the table, covered with eatables, stood in front of Walter Schnaffs, lost in amazement and still standing at the window. After some moments of hesitation he climbed in at the window and approached the table. His fierce hunger caused him to tremble as if he were in a fever, but fear still held him back, numbed him. He listened. The entire house seemed to shudder. Doors closed, quick steps ran along the floor above. The uneasy Prussian listened eagerly to these confused sounds. Then he heard dull sounds, as though bodies were falling to the ground at the foot of the walls, human beings jumping from the first floor. Then all motion, all disturbance ceased, and the great chateau became as silent as the grave. Walter Schnaffs sat down before a clean plate and began to eat. He took great mouthfuls, as if he feared he might be interrupted before he had swallowed enough. He shovelled the food into his mouth, open like a trap, with both hands, and chunks of food went into his stomach, swelling out his throat as it passed down. Now and then he stopped, almost ready to burst like a stopped-up pipe. Then he would take the cider jug and wash down his esophagus as one washes out a clogged rain-pipe. He emptied all the plates, all the dishes, and all the bottles. Then, intoxicated with drink and food, besotted, red in the face, shaken by hiccups, his mind clouded and his speech thick, he unbuttoned his uniform in order to breathe, or he could not have taken a step. His eyes closed, his mind became torpid. He leaned his heavy forehead on his folded arms on the table, and gradually lost all consciousness of things and events. The last quarter of the moon above the trees in the park shed a faint light on the landscape. It was the chill hour that precedes the dawn. Numerous silent shadows glided among the trees, and occasionally a blade of steel gleamed in the shadow as a ray of moonlight struck it. The quiet chateau stood there in dark outline. Only 2 windows were still lighted up on the ground floor. Suddenly a voice thundered, "Forward! Nom, nom, nom! To the breach, my lads!" And in an instant the doors, shutters, and window-panes fell in beneath a wave of men, who rushed in, breaking, destroying everything, and took the house by storm. In a moment 50 soldiers, armed to the teeth, bounded into the kitchen where Walter Schnaffs was peacefully sleeping, and placing to his breast 50 loaded rifles, they overturned him, rolled him on the floor, seized him, and tied his head and feet together. He gasped in amazement, too besotted to understand, perplexed, bruised, and wild with fear. Suddenly a big soldier, covered with gold lace, put his feet on his stomach, shouting, "You are my prisoner! Surrender!" The Prussian heard only the one word, "prisoner," and he sighed, "Ja, ja, ja." He was raised from the floor, tied in a chair, and examined with lively curiosity by his victors, who were blowing like whales. Several of them sat down, done up with excitement and fatigue. He smiled, actually smiled, secure now that he was at last a prisoner. Another officer came into the room and said, "Colonel, the enemy has escaped. Several seem to have been wounded. We are in possession." The big officer, who was wiping his forehead, exclaimed, "Victory!" And he wrote in a little business memorandum book which he took from his pocket, "After a desperate encounter, the Prussians were obliged to beat a retreat, carrying with them their dead and wounded, the number of whom is estimated at 50 men. Several were taken prisoners." The young officer inquired, "What step shall I take, Colonel?" "We will retire in good order," replied the colonel, "to avoid having to return and make another attack with artillery and a larger force of men." And he gave the command to set out. The column drew up in a line in the darkness beneath the walls of the chateau and filed out, a guard of 6 soldiers with revolvers in their hands surrounding Walter Schnaffs, who was firmly bound. Scouts were sent ahead to reconnoitre. They advanced cautiously, halting from time to time. At daybreak they arrived at the district of La Roche-Choiselle, whose National Guard had accomplished this feat of arms. The uneasy and excited inhabitants were expecting them. When they saw the prisoner's helmet, tremendous shouts arose. The women raised their 10 arms in wonder. The old people wept. An old grandfather threw his crutch at the Prussian and struck the nose of one of their defenders. The colonel roared, "See that the prisoner is secure!" At length they reached the town hall. The prison was opened, and Walter Schnaffs, freed from his bonds, cast into it. 200 armed men mounted guard outside the building. Then, in spite of the indigestion that had been troubling him for some time, the Prussian, wild with joy, began to dance about, to dance frantically, throwing out his arms and legs and uttering wild shouts until he fell down exhausted beside the wall. He was a prisoner saved. That was how the Château de Charpigny was taken from the enemy after only 6 hours of occupation. Colonel Ratier, a cloth merchant, who had led the assault at the head of a body of the National Guard of La Roche-Choiselle, was decorated with an order. End of Walter Schnaffs' adventure.
Where Love Is, There God Is Also, by Leo Tolstoy. Translated from the Russian by Nathan Haskell Dole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars, Rolander. Where love is, there God is also, by Leo Tolstoy. In the city lived the shoemaker Martin Avdich. He lived in a basement in a little room with one window. The window looked out on the street. Through the window he used to watch the people passing by, although only their feet could be seen. Yet by the boots Martin Avdich recognized the people. Martin Avdich had lived long in one place and had many acquaintances. Few pairs of boots in his district had not been in his hands, once and again. Some he would half-sole, some he would patch, some he would stitch around, and occasionally he would also put on new uppers. And through the window he often recognized his work. Avdich had plenty to do, because he was a faithful workman, used good material, did not make exorbitant charges, and kept his word. If it was possible for him to finish an order by a certain time, he would accept it. Otherwise he would not deceive you. He would tell you so beforehand, and all knew Avdich, and he was never out of work. Avdich had always been a good man, but as he grew old, he began to think more about his soul and get nearer to God. Martin's wife had died when he was still living with his master. His wife left him a boy 3 years old. None of their other children had lived. All the eldest had died in childhood. Martin at first intended to send his little son to his sister in the village, but afterward he felt sorry for him. He thought to himself, "It will be hard for my Kapitoshka to live in a strange family. I shall keep him with me." And Avdich left his master and went into lodgings with his little son. But God gave Avdich no luck with his children. As Kapitoshka grew older, he began to help his father and would have been a delight to him. But a sickness fell on him. He went to bed, suffered a week, and died. Martin buried his son and fell into despair. So deep was this despair that he began to complain of God. Martin fell into such a melancholy state that more than once he prayed to God for death, and reproached God because he had not taken him, who was an old man, instead of his beloved only son. Avdich also ceased to go to church. And once a little old man from the same district came from Troitsa to see Avdich. For 7 years he had been wandering about. Avdich talked with him and began to complain about his sorrows. "I have no desire to live any longer," he said. "I only wish I was dead. That is all I pray God for. I am a man without anything to hope for now." And the little old man said to him, "You don't talk right, Martin. We must not judge God's doings. The world moves not by our skill, but by God's will. God decreed for your son to die, for you to live. So it is for the best. And you are in despair because you wish to live for your own happiness." "But what shall one live for?" asked Martin. And the little old man said, "We must live for God, Martin. He gives you life, and for his sake you must live. When you begin to live for him, you will not grieve over anything, and all will seem easy to you." Martin kept silent for a moment and then said, "But how can one live for God?" And the little old man said, "Christ has taught us how to live for God. You know how to read? Buy a testament and read it. There you will learn how to live for God. Everything is explained there." And these words kindled a fire in Avdich's heart, and he went that very same day, bought a New Testament in large print, and began to read. At first Avdich intended to read only on holidays, but as he began to read, It so cheered his soul that he used to read every day. At times he would become so absorbed in reading that all the kerosene in the lamp would burn out, and still he could not tear himself away. And so Avdich used to read every evening. And the more he read, the clearer he understood what God wanted of him, and how one should live for God. And his heart kept growing easier and easier. Formerly, when he lay down to sleep, he used to sigh and groan, and always thought of his Kapitoshka, and now his only exclamation was, Glory to thee, Lord, thy will be done. And from that time Avdich's whole life was changed. In other days he, too, used to drop into a public house as a holiday amusement, to drink a cup of tea, and he was not averse to a little brandy either. He would take a drink with some acquaintance and leave the saloon not intoxicated exactly, yet in a happy frame of mind, and inclined to talk nonsense and shout and use abusive language at a person. Now he left off that sort of thing. His life became quiet and joyful. In the morning he would sit down to work, finish his allotted task, then take the little lamp from the hook, put it on the table, get his book from the shelf, open it, and sit down to read. And the more he read, the more he understood, and the brighter and happier it grew in his heart. Once it happened that Martwin read till late into the night. He was reading the Gospel of Luke. He was reading over the 6th chapter, and he was reading the verses, And unto him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer also the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy coat also. Give to every man that asketh of thee. And of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. And as ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. He read farther also those verses where God speaks. And why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Whosoever cometh to me, and heareth my sayings, and doth them, I will shew you to whom he is like. He is like a man which built an house, and digged deep, and laid the foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently upon that house, and could not shake it, for it was founded upon a rock. But he that heareth and doth not is like a man that without a foundation built an house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. Avdich read these words, and joy filled his soul. He took off his spectacles, put them down on the book, leaned his elbows on the table, and became lost in thought. And he began to measure his life by these words, and he thought to himself, Is my house built on the rock or on the sand? 'Tis well if on the rock. It is so easy when you are alone by yourself. It seems as if you had done everything as God commands, but when you forget yourself, you sin again. Yet I shall still struggle on. It is very good. Help me, Lord. Thus ran his thoughts. He wanted to go to bed, but he felt loath to tear himself away from the book, and he began to read farther in the 7th chapter. He read about the centurion, he read about the widow's son, he read about the answer given to John's disciples, and finally he came to that place where the rich Pharisee desired the Lord to sit at meat with him. And he read how the woman that was a sinner anointed his feet, and washed them with her tears, and how he forgave her. He reached the 44th verse and began to read. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, Seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman since the time I came in hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. He finished reading these verses and thought to himself, Thou gavest me no water for my feet, thou gavest me no kiss, my head with oil thou didst not anoint. And again Avdich took off his spectacles, put them down on the book, and again he became lost in thought. It seems that Pharisee must have been such a man as I am. I, too, apparently have thought only of myself, how I might have my tea, be warm and comfortable, but never to think about my guest. He thought about himself, but there was not the least care taken of the guest. And who was his guest? The Lord himself. If he had come to me, should I have done the same way? Avdich rested his head upon both his arms and did not notice that he fell asleep. Martwin suddenly seemed to sound in his ears. Martwin started from his sleep. Who is here? He turned around, glanced toward the door. No one. Again he fell into a doze. Suddenly he plainly heard, Martwin? Ah, Martwin, look tomorrow on the street. I am coming. Martwin awoke, rose from the chair, began to rub his eyes. He himself could not tell whether he heard those words in his dream or in reality. He turned down his lamp and went to bed. At daybreak next morning Avdich rose, made his prayer to God, lighted the stove, put on the ski and the kasha, put the water in the samovar, put on his apron, and sat down by the window to work. And while he was working, he kept thinking about all that had happened the day before. It seemed to him, at one moment, that it was a dream, and now he had really heard a voice. Well, he said to himself, such things have been. Martwin was sitting by the window and looking out more than he was working. When anyone passed by in boots which he did not know, he would bend down, look out of the window, in order to see not only the feet, but also the face. The dvornik passed by in new felt boots. The water carrier passed by. Then there came up the window an old soldier of Nicola's time, in an old pair of laced felt boots, with a shovel in his hands. Avdich recognized him by his felt boots. The old man's name was Stepanich, and a neighboring merchant out of charity gave him a home with him. He was required to assist the dvornik. Stepanich began to shovel away the snow from in front of Avdich's window. Avdich glanced at him and took up his work again. Pshaw! I must be getting crazy in my old age, said Avdich, and laughed at himself. Stepanich is clearing away the snow, and I imagine that Christ is coming to see me. I was entirely out of my mind, old dotard that I am. Avdich sewed about a dozen stitches, and then felt impelled to look through the window again. He looked out again through the window, and saw that Stepanich had leaned his shovel against the wall, and was warming himself and resting. He was an old, broken-down man. Evidently he had not strength enough even to shovel the snow. Avdich said to himself, I will give him some tea. By the way, the samovar has only just gone out. Avdich laid down his awl, rose from his seat, put the samovar on the table, poured out the tea and tapped with his finger at the glass. Stepanitch turned around and came to the window. Avdich beckoned to him and went to open the door. "Come in and warm yourself a little," he said. "You must be cold." "May Christ reward you for this. My bones ache," said Stepanitch. Stepanitch came in and shook off the snow, tried to wipe his feet so as not to soil the floor, but staggered. "Don't trouble to wipe your feet. I will clean it up myself. We are used to such things. Come in and sit down," said Avdich. "Here, drink a cup of tea." And Avdich lifted 2 glasses and handed one to his guest, while he himself poured his tea into a saucer and began to blow it. Stepanitch finished drinking his glass of tea, turned the glass upside down, put the half-eaten lump of sugar on it, and began to express his thanks, but it was evident he wanted some more. "Have some more," said Avdich, filling both his own glass and his guest's. Avdich drank his tea, but from time to time glanced out into the street. "Are you expecting anyone?" asked his guest. "Am I expecting anyone? I am ashamed even to tell whom I expect. I am, and I am not expecting someone, but one word has kindled a fire in my heart. Whether it is a dream or something else, I do not know. Don't you see, brother, I was reading yesterday the gospel about Christ, the Batushka, how he suffered, how he walked on the earth. I suppose you have heard about it." "Indeed I have," replied Stepanitch, "but we are people in darkness, we can't read." "Well, now I was reading about that very thing, how he walked on the earth. I read, you know, how he came to the Pharisee, and the Pharisee did not treat him hospitably. Well, and so, my brother, I was reading yesterday about this very thing, and was thinking to myself how he did not receive Christ, the Batushka, with honor. Suppose, for example, he should come to me or anyone else, I said to myself, I should not even know how to receive him. And he gave him no reception at all. Well, while I was thus thinking, I fell asleep, brother, and I heard someone call me by name. I got up, the voice, just as if someone whispered, said, 'Be on the watch. I shall come tomorrow.' And this happened twice. Well, would you believe it? It got into my head. I scolded myself, and yet I am expecting him, the Batushka." Stepanitch shook his head and said nothing. He finished drinking his glass of tea and put it on the side, but Avdich picked up the glass again and filled it once more. "Drink some more for your good health. You see, I have an idea that when the Batushka went about on this earth, he disdained no one, and had more to do with the simple people. He always went to see the simple people. He picked out his disciples more from among folk like such sinners as we are, from the working class. Said he, whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and he who is humbled shall become exalted, said he. You call me Lord, and, said he, I wash your feet. Whoever wishes, said he, to be the first, the same shall be a servant to all. Because, said he, blessed are the poor, the humble, the kind, the generous." And Stepanitch forgot about his tea. He was an old man, and easily moved to tears. He was listening, and the tears rolled down his face. "Come now, have some more tea," said Avdich. But Stepanitch made the sign of the cross, thanked him, turned down his glass, and arose. "Thanks to you," he says, "Martwin Avdich, for treating me kindly and satisfying me, soul and body." "You are welcome. Come in again. Always glad to see a friend," said Avdich. Stepanitch departed, and Martwin poured out the rest of the tea, drank it up, put away the dishes, and sat down again by the window to work, to stitch on a patch. He kept stitching away, and at the same time looking through the window. He was expecting Christ, and was all the while thinking of him and his deeds, and his head was filled with the different speeches of Christ. 2 soldiers passed by. One wore boots furnished by the crown, and the other one boots that he had made. Then the master of the next house passed by in shining galoshes. Then a baker with a basket passed by. All passed by, and now there came also by the window a woman in woolen stockings and rustic bashmaks on her feet. She passed by the window and stood still near the window case. Avditch looked up at her from the window and saw it was a stranger, a woman poorly clad and with a child. She was standing by the wall with her back to the wind, trying to wrap up the child, and she had nothing to wrap it up in. The woman was dressed in shabby summer clothes, and from behind the frame Avditch could hear the child crying and the woman trying to pacify it, but she was not able to pacify it. Avditch got up, went to the door, ascended the steps and cried, "My good woman! Hey, my good woman!" The woman heard him and turned around. "Why are you standing in the cold with the child? Come into my room, where it is warm. You can manage it better. Here, this way." The woman was astonished. She saw an old man in an apron, with spectacles on his nose, calling her to him. She followed him. They descended the steps and entered the room. The old man led the woman to his bed. "There," says he, "sit down, my good woman, nearer to the stove. You can get warm and nurse the little one." "I have no milk for him. I myself have not eaten anything since morning," said the woman, but nevertheless she took the baby to her breast. Avditch shook his head, went to the table, brought out the bread and a dish, opened the oven door, poured into the dish some cabbage soup, took out the pot with the gruel, but it was not cooked as yet, so he filled the dish with tea only and put it on the table. He got the bread, took the towel down from the hook and spread it upon the table. "Sit down," he says, "and eat, my good woman, and I will mind the little one. You see, I once had children of my own. I know how to handle them." The woman crossed herself, sat down at the table and began to eat while Avditch took a seat on the bed near the infant. Avditch kept smacking and smacking to it with his lips, but it was a poor kind of smacking, for he had no teeth. The little one kept on crying, and it occurred to Avditch to threaten the little one with his finger. He waved his finger right before the child's mouth and hastily withdrew it. He did not put it to its mouth because his finger was black and soiled with wax, and the little one looked at his finger and became quiet. Then it began to smile, and Avditch also was glad. While the woman was eating, she told who she was and whither she was going. Said she, "I'm a soldier's wife. It is now 7 months since they sent my husband away off, and no tidings. I lived out as cook. The baby was born. No one cared to keep me with the child. This is the 3rd month that I have been struggling along without a place. I ate up all I had. I wanted to engage as a wet nurse. No one would take me. I'm too thin, they say. I have just been to the merchant's wife, where lives a young woman I know, and so they promised to take us in. I thought that was the end of it, but she told me to come next week. and she lives a long way off. I got tired out, and it tired him too, my heart's darling. Fortunately, our landlady takes pity on us for the sake of Christ, and gives us a room, else I don't know how I should manage to get along." Avdich sighed and said, "Haven't you any warm clothes?" "Now is the time, friend, to wear warm clothes, but yesterday I pawned my last shawl for a 20-kopeck piece." The woman came to the bed and took the child, and Avdich rose, went to the partition, rummaged round, and succeeded in finding an old coat. "Na," says he, "it is a poor thing, yet you may turn it to some use." The woman looked at the coat and looked at the old man. She took the coat and burst into tears, and Avdich turned away his head. Crawling under the bed, he pushed out a little trunk, rummaged in it, and sat down again opposite the woman. And the woman said, "May Christ bless you, little grandfather. He must have sent me to your window. My little baby would have frozen to death. When I started out it was warm, but now it has grown cold. And he, the Batushka, led you to look through the window and take pity on me, an unfortunate." Avdich smiled and said, "Indeed he did that. I have been looking through the window, my good woman, for some wise reason." And Martwin told the soldier's wife his dream and how he heard the voice, how the Lord promised to come and see him that day. "All things are possible," said the woman. She rose, put on the coat, wrapped up her little child in it, and as she started to take leave, she thanked Avdich again. "Take this for Christ's sake," said Avdich, giving her a 20-kopeck piece. "Redeem your shawl." She made the sign of the cross, and Avdich made the sign of the cross and went with her to the door. The woman went away. Avdich ate some tea, washed the dishes, and sat down again to work. While he was working, he still remembered the window. When the window grew darker, he immediately looked out to see who was passing by. Acquaintances passed by, and strangers passed by, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. But here Avdich saw that an old apple woman had stopped in front of his window. She carried a basket with apples. Only a few were left, as she had evidently sold them nearly all out, and over her shoulder she had a bag full of chips. She must have gathered them up in some new building and was on her way home. One could see that the bag was heavy on her shoulder. She tried to shift it to the other shoulder. So she lowered the bag on the sidewalk, stood the basket with the apples on a little post, and began to shake down the splinters in the bag. And while she was shaking her bag, a little boy in a torn cap came along, picked up an apple from the basket, and was about to make his escape. But the old woman noticed it, turned around, and caught the youngster by his sleeve. The little boy began to struggle, tried to tear himself away, but the old woman grasped him with both hands, knocked off his cap, and caught him by the hair. The little boy was screaming. The old woman was scolding. Avdich lost no time in putting away his awl. He threw it upon the floor, sprang to the door. He even stumbled on the stairs and dropped his spectacles and rushed out into the street. The old woman was pulling the youngster by his hair and was scolding and threatening to take him to the policeman. The youngster was defending himself and denying the charge. "I did not take it," he said. "What are you licking me for? Let me go." Avdich tried to separate them. He took the boy by his arm and said, "Let him go, babushka. Forgive him for Christ's sake." "I will forgive him so that he won't forget it till the new broom grows. I'm going to take the little villain to the police." Avdich began to entreat the old woman. "Let him go, babushka," he said. "He will never do it again. Let him go, for Christ's sake." The old woman let him loose. The boy started to run, but Avdich kept him back. "Ask the babushka's forgiveness," he said, "and don't you ever do it again. I saw you take the apple." The boy burst into tears and began to ask forgiveness. "There now, that's right, and here's an apple for you." And Avdich took an apple from the basket and gave it to the boy. "I will pay you for it, babushka," he said to the old woman. "You ruin them that way, the good-for-nothings," said the old woman. "He ought to be treated so that he would remember it for a whole week." Babushka, babushka," said Avdich. "That is right according to our judgment, but not according to God's. If he is to be whipped for an apple, then what ought to be done to us for our sins?" The old woman was silent, and Avdich told her the parable of the master who forgave a debtor all that he owed him, and how the debtor went and began to choke one who owed him. The old woman listened, and the boy stood listening. "God has commanded us to forgive," said Avdich, "else we too may not be forgiven. All should be forgiven, and the thoughtless especially." The old woman shook her head and sighed. "That's so," said she, "but the trouble is that they are very much spoiled." "Then we who are older must teach them," said Avdich. "That's just what I say," remarked the old woman. "I myself have had 7 of them. Only 1 daughter is left." And the old woman began to relate where and how she lived with her daughter, and how many grandchildren she had. "Here," she says, "my strength is only so, and yet I have to work. I pity the youngsters, my grandchildren. But what nice children they are! No one gives me such a welcome as they do. Aksintka won't go to anyone but me. Babushka, dear babushka, loveliest." And the old woman grew quite sentimental. "Of course it is a childish trick. God be with him," said she, pointing to the boy. The woman was just about to lift the bag upon her shoulder when the boy ran up and said, "Let me carry it, babushka. It is on my way." The old woman nodded her head and put the bag on the boy's back, and side by side they passed along the street. And the old woman even forgot to ask Avdich to pay for the apple. Avdich stood motionless and kept gazing after them, and he heard them talking all the time as they walked away. After Avdich saw them disappear, he returned to his room. He found his eyeglasses on the stairs. They were not broken. He picked up his awl and sat down to work again. After working a little while, it grew darker, so that he could not see to sew. He saw the lamplighter passing by to light the street lamps. "It must be time to make a light," he said to himself. So he got his little lamp ready, hung it up, and he took himself again to his work. He had one boot already finished. He turned it around, looked at it. Well done! He put away his tools, swept off all the cuttings, cleared off the bristles and ends, took the lamp, set it on the table, and took down the Gospels from the shelf. He intended to open the book at the very place where he had yesterday put a piece of leather as a mark. But it happened to open at another place, and the moment Avdich opened the Testament, he recollected his last night's dream, and as soon as he remembered it, it seemed as if he heard someone stepping about behind him. Avdich looked around and saw, there in the dark corner, it seemed as if people were standing. He was at a loss to know who they were, and a voice whispered in his ear, "Martwin, ah, Martwin, did you not recognize me?" "Who?" exclaimed Avdich. "Me," repeated the voice. "It was I." And Stepanich stepped forth from the dark corner. He smiled, and like a little cloud faded away and soon vanished. "And it was I," said the voice. From the dark corner stepped forth the woman with her child. The woman smiled, the child laughed, and they also vanished. "And it was I," continued the voice. Both the old woman and the boy with the apple stepped forward. Both smiled and vanished. Avdich's soul rejoiced. He crossed himself, put on his spectacles, and began to read the Evangelists where it happened to open. On the upper part of the page he read, "For I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in." And on the lower part of the page he read this, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." St. Matthew chapter 25. And Avdich understood that his dream had not deceived him, that the Saviour really called on him that day, and that he really received him. End of Where Love Is, There God Is Also by Leo Tolstoy. Read by Lars Rolander.